Welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Nicole Cook. I am the Augusta Baker Chair at the University of South Carolina School of Information Science. And welcome to our Spring 2021 Baker Diversity Lecture Series. And this is our second lecture today by Dr. Beth Patin for our series. And we are so glad that you're here today. And so just a little housekeeping, you are in listen only mode, so you hopefully can hear us, but you are all muted. And the way that GoToWebinar works is that you won't be able to necessarily chat with the entire audience, but we are welcoming your questions. If you have questions for our speaker, there should be a tab that is titled Questions, and you can put your questions in, and Grace, my wonderful graduate assistant, and I will be keeping track of those questions, and we're going to have time for questions to talk with our speaker at the end, and we will answer as many of them as we can. So please feel free to submit your questions. And so if you would just give me a moment, we're going to give our speaker control of the show. And we will get started in just a moment. And so while Beth is getting her slides up and can share her screen with us, just want to officially and warmly welcome Dr. Beth Patin to the show, if you will. Beth is a friend and colleague for many, many years, and it's wonderful to see the work that she's doing as an assistant professor at Syracuse University, their School of Information Studies. And I saw Beth talk about this work, I don't know, before the pandemic, so it feels like 10 years ago, but doing some really exciting work and doing some truth telling that we need to be doing in library and information science. So Beth, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure before I get started that everybody can see my slides. They're up and going. Great. I am so appreciative to be here today and getting a chance to talk about my epistemicide work. As Nicole mentioned, I did talk about this last fall, and at that time it was a really new idea, and this is still the real beginning of this work for me. And I'm really excited to see where this can go in our information field and hopefully beyond. I'm really interested in hearing, you know, if the things I'm talking about today, if you're connecting with them, and, you know, what things you think I might be missing so I can make this conceptualization more robust in the future. So first, I'd really like to give thanks to South Carolina and the College of Communication and Information, and of course, Dr. Cook and Grace Jones for hosting this event and helping me through all the technological challenges I've had today, getting to be here to talk. And I especially need to thank my co-authors on this work, Melinda Sebastian, Jun Yeon, Danielle Bertolini, and Alexandra Grimm, and also our research group at Syracuse, focusing on library and information. We're called LIT, the Library and Information Investigative Team, and I'm really proud of the work that is coming out of that space. And I think before I get started, I'd also like to thank all of the researchers, librarians, and information scientists who have been continuously, fiercely, and unapologetically doing this work for years and generations. This work is being done in our field, but it's being siloed, it's being devalued, and it's being pushed to the side. And one of the things that I hope this work points out is not that we aren't doing social justice work in our field, but that we aren't doing it in an inclusive way where this is touching every space of information science. And, you know, we are still in 2021 as a community talking about neutrality, talking about why social justice is important. And one of the motivations for doing this work is to point out, you know, we are harming our communities through our policies, through our processes, and through our behaviors. And I really want us to think about the harm we are doing to people's ways of knowing. So if you ever take a lecture with me, you'll know that I like to start us off with a question. And today is no different. One question I think we are constantly asking ourselves as librarians and information scientists and academics is, how do we support people's capacity to know? We talk about this a lot, but we should also be talking about, how do we harm people's capacity to know? Whom do we support and whom do we harm? Without really interrogating these things, we aren't doing the best information science that we could be doing. So my outline for today's talk is to first introduce the concept of epistemicide, give some examples of each type of epistemic injustice, describe the harms that I see occurring because of these injustices, explain why it's important for us in LIS, and start to discuss some justice-oriented solutions. It's really important to recognize that this work is really in its initial stages. And so, you know, part of solving problems is just articulating what those problems are. And this work is very much focused on that first stage. So if epistemology is the way we know, or ways of knowing, or our knowledge systems, then building on the work of Sousa, decolonizing and liberation work, epistemicide is the killing, silencing, annihilation, or devaluing of a knowledge system. It is the harm we do collectively, systemically, and structurally to people's knowledge systems. And we have lots of examples of this throughout the history of the world. We can think about the epistemologies that were harmed during the transatlantic slave trade. We can think about the persecution of women in the 1600s and other times, and the ways that they were persecuted for women's ways of knowing. We might also look at indigenous residential boarding schools and the knowledges and the epistemologies that were lost and harmed in those acts. We can also look to book burnings in Nazi Germany and the way that we eradicated queer research in those communities. And it's also important for us to think about how this happens in modern days. How are we currently in the United States harming the people that we are holding in concentration camps on our US borders? How are we harming those children's epistemologies, you know, right now as we speak? So those are some really big examples, and you know, I think easy to wrap your mind around examples of what epistemicide is. It is this large, structured, systematic way that we annihilate the ways that communities know things. And we can do this through fire, we can do this through war, and we can do this through text. We can do this by erasing people's voices. But it's important for us to know, and especially important for us in academia and library and information science, to keep in mind that this doesn't just happen in this overly violent and total and complete destructive way. But in fact, there are also individual instances of these epistemic injustices which collectively lead to an epistemicide. So if we continue to have individual injustices and they're happening in all of these spaces, then we start moving towards epistemicide. So an epistemic injustice, building on the work from Gender and Women's Studies of Miranda Fricker, is the wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. And this is really what I want us to think about today in information science, as librarians, as faculty members of those people who are training and teaching librarians to go out into the world. How are we harming people in their capacity as a knower? And how can we try to start undoing that harm? Fricker identified two types of testimony of epistemic injustice, the first being testimonial and the second hermeneutical. And we, in hopefully our new journal article, will be adding two more kinds, participatory and curricular. And I want to take a moment to define and put each of these in context for us now. So first, testimonial injustice is when a prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. And this is Fricker's direct definition. In my paper, I take issue with the use of the terms hearer and speaker, and try to use like message and sender, something that is a little bit more inclusive, because testimonial injustice doesn't just happen to us when we're talking. It happens in all kinds of ways. One of the examples that Fricker uses in her book to demonstrate testimonial injustice is in To Kill a Mockingbird, when the jury doesn't believe Tom Robinson's very truthful, very believable testimony. And the reasons why it's not believed really gets down to a prejudice. It's disappointing that so many of us in the United States could be exposed to reading To Kill a Mockingbird and yet still have problems connecting this type of testimonial injustice to the testimonial injustices that Black people face as they move through our communities, especially when they're dealing with police forces. You know, we live in a country where I can't breathe is not, that testimony does not get enough credibility. And I included this cartoon about this idea of testimonial injustice because I think it really brings home one of the important parts about this. That's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. Unfortunately, probably many of us have been in situations where our participation has been discounted because of who we are, not because of the value of that participation itself. And that's what this really captures. The idea, the evidence is solid, but we'd rather hear it from someone else. Hermeneutical injustice is a gap in the collective interpretive resources. Creating a barrier for someone who is trying to make sense of their social experiences. The example Fricker gives in her book is about the Anita Hill testimony and how this testimony gave a whole generation of women the language to talk about what it meant to be sexually harassed at work. So many people were familiar with that experience, but until we can give it a name, until we can, add language around that, it is really hard to address it and, make it illegal. And through this court testimony, we saw so many policies and laws change surrounding sexual harassment. And of course, a really modern day example of this is the Me Too movement. Levy and Matson tell us from 2020 that in the 3 years after the Me Too movement, we've seen increases of reports of sexual assault increase in some countries up to 20%. And this is really, when we name these things that are wrong in our communities, in our experiences, in our educational programs, that is when we can start to try to address them. Participatory injustice is the exclusion of one's participation in their own epistemological development during and this includes completely keeping someone from being able to participate, but it also includes dismissive behaviors, such as keeping somebody out of the loop or ostracizing them or isolating them. An example I'd like to give for this is an example of my grandfather, who grew up in Alabama in a time where schools were segregated and actually had to leave the state of Alabama because there was no place where a Black man could get a medical degree. Even after he got his medical degree and started his own practice, he still couldn't attend the professional development workshops that his colleagues were privy to. Sometimes he had to sit in the kitchen or sit in other rooms, meaning that he could not participate in continuing to develop his medical practice and knowledge the same way that his colleagues can. And I think a pretty solid modern day example of this is the grade system that, the grade algorithm that UT Austin's computer science program has been using to decide who gets into their PhD program and who doesn't. Creating an algorithm to read personal letters, using rank systems of what universities are elite and not elite is really just reinforcing our biases, our standards, and maintaining the status quo. What might UT Austin's computer science program look like today if they weren't using this algorithm, to decide who belongs here and who doesn't? Curricular injustice happens when physical resources are not available to help the epistemic growth or are used to suppress and eliminate the creation of rival knowledges. Carter G. Woodson told us this 100 years ago. He told us that we were miseducating the Negro, but also everyone else. When we silo the information about Black people in the United States to only being talked about in February, when we only talk about the Black community in relation to civil rights and slavery, we are doing a disservice to all of the ways and all of the different facets of what being Black in America means. And it's not just about those two experiences. And frankly, even though we only talk about those two experiences, we don't even talk about those well. So that's another thing I want to talk about. And a modern day example of curriculum injustice, this historian is going back at Harvard, is going back and looking at how the title of the article was How Textbooks Taught White Supremacy. I updated the title of the article to Our Teaching, or How Textbooks Teach White Supremacy, because we are still doing this today. It is critical that we take a step back and really look at whose values are we privileging, whose voices are we amplifying, and how can we build a space that values and demonstrates commitment to inclusion and supporting all of the voices in our community. And these injustices hurt people. They cause harm. Fricker tells us that there's two kinds of harms that are happening, but I actually think that there is a third. She tells us that there is a primary harm that's experienced by the individual and a primary harm that's experienced by the collective. And I want to add to this argument that I think there is a harm experienced in the future. And I think that this idea of a third harm is really nebulous and hard to quantify. So take, for instance, a new researcher that is really excited and coming into a field, and one of the first things they hear when they're working to establish a research agenda is keep your research out of the diversity ghetto. So there's a lot of implications in that term. Diversity research isn't as valued in this space as in other spaces. That alone is not going to get you tenure. And when that happens to a person, that person is harmed, and not just in that one time, but right, they think about, well, if you're anything like me, you think about it over and over again. But there's also a secondary harm happening there. That institution in that moment is also missing out on the work and the ideas that that researcher can bring into that space. So often in academia, we talk about bringing in communities of color. We talk about this in librarianship. How can we get more librarians of color? But let's not bring anybody else into this space until we fix ourselves. And we are not doing that. And if we look at this third level of harm, what does it mean when we have stifled people's research? In academia, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are building and extending the work of those who have come before us. If we don't let them participate, we can't build on their work. So if we go back to that example with UT Austin, how many computer scientists in the past 10 years are we missing out on their inventions, their ideas, their concepts, because they weren't even allowed to play the game in the first place? So why is this important for LIS and academia? First, I think that, well, let me go back for a second and talk here. Academia and LIS are intimately and explicitly responsible for the creation of knowledge, the archiving, the protection, the storage of knowledge, making knowledge findable, and making, sure that it is shared out there in the world. We have a extremely important relationship with what is considered to be knowledge, whose knowledge is important, how we talk about that knowledge, how we find that knowledge, and how we share that knowledge. So I want to give you some examples of these injustices as they've happened in information science in our field. And I really am talking, about some of my own personal experiences and some, larger experiences that are happening in LIS, and why it's problematic, why it's harmful for us. So about 4 years ago, actually almost 4 years exactly to this day, I was on a panel at Elise where our panel title was Communities in Crisis, What Everyday Acts of Terrorism Tell Us About Social Responsibility in LIS. At that panel, after having, several brilliant professors, PhD students of color talk about how we felt in our communities and how we felt terrorized moving through space and what we thought LIS needed to do about it, our response from our audience was to debate the semantics of using the word terrorism. Rather than counting our testimony as valid, an outsider pushed back on our own feelings of feeling terrorized. How do you get to tell me how I feel within my community? And what have I ever done for that testimony to not be counted in this space? And rather than us addressing collectively how we could act in a social responsibly way in LIS, we debated semantics. And so often when people are trying to make changes, we see this derailing because we are not listening to BIPOC librarians. We are not listening to our BIPOC professors. It is really important that we think about how we view people's testimonies in LIS. I hate to be extra meta about this, but really epistemicide is a really good example of a hermeneutical injustice. For me, when I started to recognize these injustices happening in my space, around me and to my colleagues, I knew that this was happening. I could feel it. It was visceral, but I didn't know what it was. And I didn't know how we could fix this until I really found some language to help me talk about, and to help me name this problem. Participatory injustices, I talked about, completely excluding people, but let's talk about our journal access. Let's talk about our expectations of professors trying to get tenure. I want to do information equity work. To get tenure, I need to belong to an information research community, and I need to publish in important journals and at, prestigious conferences. And most of those places don't have open access, which means many of the community members that I'm trying to reach with my work won't have access to it. What does it mean when we in academia And of course, libraries are complicit within this predatory journal situation. What does it mean when we are doing information equity work that isn't even available to our community at large? And finally, curriculum and justice. After the riots in Minneapolis and the murder of George Floyd, we saw many of our institutions taking a really close look at themselves. The State Library of Virginia was accused of racism because they have archived all of the governor's materials before their first Black governor and have archived most of the gubernatorial materials after that Black governor. And here in Alabama, we also had our State Department of Archives and History acknowledge that they have been intentionally not collecting Alabama's Black history and rather privileging the collection of Confederate memorabilia. These are our institutes of history, our archives, where we should be able to go to access truthful and factual information. What does it mean when we as librarians are distorting that story? What does it mean when we have intentionally privileged and intentionally excluded voices in our collection? We have to do better than this. So, what does it mean for us to move towards justice? So I want to give you, an example for us in information science. An example of an injustice is Indigenous perspectives missing from mainstream catalogs. A justice-focused solution is the creation of a thesaurus that allows for the Indigenous community's epistemic power. So an example of justice is the Mashantucket Pequot Thesaurus of the American Indian Terminology, which is a method to integrate Indigenous perspectives into mainstream controlled vocabularies. It is really important that we name these injustices. It's a hermeneutical injustice because we don't have the language to allow Indigenous communities epistemic power to present themselves in our controlled vocabulary. And here's a solution where we are working to make sure those important terminologies are also included in a way where we can all use and access them. If we think about correcting curriculums, we want to look towards building archival programs, digital exhibits, and preserving and maintaining historical and primary documents that are telling these untold stories that have been traditionally overlooked. And I want to say overlooked, but that makes it seem more innocent, than I really believe it is. But we want to look towards building these curriculums and making sure that we are training librarians to go out into the world to really take critical looks at our collections and what is being shared. I think it's important for us to think about our testimonial and hermeneutical biases. So often I see my colleagues, both librarians and faculty members of color, who have tried and tried and tried again to share their stories and their experiences of not being included and what it means to be demeaned and devalued in our field. And time again, I watch us collectively not listen. Y'all, these stories are out there. There are published books in, published research in all of those ways that academia wants to qualify what counts as knowledge. It's out there. We have a specific issue for our Jealous journal, where many of our faculty of color talk about their experiences of being excluded in academia. When your BIPOC librarians tell you something, when your faculty members tell you something, believe them. And I think that if we're gonna spend time thinking about our epistemologies and our theoretical frameworks, we also need to reevaluate our methods. understanding decolonizing methodology, but also understanding the racism that has happened and has been involved in research since the beginning. I also want us to think about citational justice and how we call in other voices into our space. How do we make sure that we are practicing true inclusion by allowing other people to participate? Citations are important if you're trying to get tenure. What does it mean if we are valuing citations in a field where I'm writing for practitioners that aren't necessarily going to publish and cite my work? It doesn't mean it doesn't have value. I want to be able to participate at this level. And so, you know, for me, it means that we really need to think about, how do we think about who is participating in the LIS field and creating knowledge here? What other ways might we account for that participation and the impact that that participation is having? So what's next for this work? I mentioned in the beginning that this work is very new, it's novel. This is my, first attempt, or, sort of my second attempt at trying to articulate it. And I have a lot of questions about it. I'm wondering first, what other types of epistemic injustices am I missing? I feel very convinced about those 4, and I'm looking forward to proving those in the future. But like, what else is happening? How else are we harming people in their epistemic journeys? I have a book chapter that will be coming out, sometime this year, that is specifically looking at curriculum epistemicide in MLIS programs, how we are letting our librarians down by not including other voices, not valuing people's testimony, and not having the own resources that we need as faculty members to evaluate new work. So what do I mean by that? If you've tried to get something published and you've ever gotten some peer reviews back, and it's really clear that the people reading your articles have not engaged with any type of critical race, inclusion, equity work, it's really disheartening the ways in which we are harming the process of getting this knowledge out. We as faculty members have a huge gap in our hermeneutical. We have a huge gap in our hermeneutical processes. We have new faculty members that are coming with expertise in critical race theory, but many of us on the faculty don't know how to evaluate that research because we don't know enough about it. And so it's, and I think about this too in our cultural competence classes. So often I have students who come in who are not prepared to talk about race. It is a whole lack in their hermeneutical structure. Y'all, there's a whole world and history of work and provenance talking about race and information science. There is, it's okay not to know everything, right? None of us can, but we are past the time of having to teach diversity 101 time and time again. It's time for us to start addressing these instances of injustice. I want to specifically think about how epistemicide intersects with tenure and promotion. What are the ways that we have been upholding these traditional ways of knowing, or I should say Western academic ways of knowing, while devaluing other demonstrations of knowledge? I think a quick example of that is, when we tell our professors to not focus less on community service, when so many of us, we get into this work because we care about the community. And because this is, an initial conception of this framework, I am hoping to conduct interviews and understand how people's epistemologies have been harmed through their educational processes, and how librarians think we can work harder to create more epistemic just places in LIS. So in closing, I want us, moving forward to think about how, if within LIS and academia, we are upholding testimonial injustices, we are upholding hermeneutical injustices, we're upholding participatory injustices, and we're upholding curricular injustices. We are doing this systematically, we are doing this structurally, and we are doing this again and again, meaning we are responsible within our field for creating an epistemicide of information. It's really time for us to name these injustices and start to work to address them. Here are my references, which I know you won't be able to see now, but they'll be uploaded to the slides. Thank you very much, and I'm happy for us to have conversations and take any questions.
Beth, thank you so much. That was amazing. And just while people are starting to think of some of their questions that they might like to ask you, just a kind of quick comment connection. When I introduced today's session, I neglected to kind of just briefly introduce Augusta Baker, for whom we are all doing this work today. And the reason I want to mention it now is that when she was a children's librarian at the New York Public Library in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, she was among the first Black librarians to publicly and through scholarship say, our children's books are not representing our Black children appropriately, and this is unacceptable. And so as I'm listening to you give your talk, I'm thinking it was epistemic injustice that Augusta Baker was fighting in the 30s and 50s. So to Beth's point, this has been happening forever in our field and beyond. So this idea of we need to know our history in order to not repeat it, I think we need to really get on that train. So Beth, we have a couple of questions to get us started, and I'm sure a couple more will come in.
And hey, Nicole, before we get to the question, I just want to say, we can't just like study the history that's there, because that's also biased, right? We have to also be whole about what is there, because we have done such a bad job of actually documenting what happened and continuing with that story. Sorry.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, when you think about what's been valued in terms of what we consider knowledge, even, perfectly well in LIS education, libraries and library education have huge and significant histories in segregation. But we've had to dig really deep to get that history, right? Because it wasn't valued.
Right.
So absolutely.
And, I think about, our cultural competence classes and how so often those are, positioned as elective courses, right? If we look within our information, science undergrad programs, if we look at our information systems master's programs, many of those courses aren't even approaching cultural competence like LIS is. So the larger information field also really has a problem, because we have really siloed this information as an elective instead of making it a mainstream part of our conversation. If we're talking about information, we should be talking about equity and justice.
And also this, not only has it been siloed, it's been commodified. So, I know several of our dear colleagues are on the call, and, we've talked about how we do this work and how we've had students say, I'm taking this class because it's marketable. Right. Not because they care anything at all about equity. Hopefully we can, sway them over the course of the semester, but, we're in another phase of diversity being trendy, and people are using that as a commodity and not really doing it for the right reasons. So Beth, we have a couple of questions. The first one is one of our attendees would like to know if you could talk about the linkages between assimilation and epistemicide.
Yeah, I think that is a big one. I think often about, I'll speak from my own experience in what it means to try to fit into someone else's frame of what is valued as research, and coming into institutions who, you know, say they value diversity and say they value inclusion, and then in the very next moment they want you to assimilate to the cultures that we have already established. I referenced this earlier in the talk. I think that it's really important for us, if we want to open up our spaces to be inclusive, that means we as organizations have to be willing to be changed by those new people coming into our spaces. We cannot ask people to come in. We cannot ask more Black professors to come into LIS and say, do it the way we've always done it. That's not right. And you know, it needs to stop. You know, I want to see that ending today. And I think very much many scholars, librarians, and students of color will tell you that they feel like they have to walk, you know, like that tightrope in order to not deviate too far of what the expected norms are. You know, and it's a dangerous game that I want to play. Like, I want to break tenure in the way that we have historically conceptualized it. I don't think it's the best way for us to evaluate the impact we can have on knowledge. And so I'm really, you know, specifically interested in how do we think about playing that game while not assimilating to the game.
Absolutely. I love that you want to play the dangerous game. It is dangerous indeed. Next question. Another of our attendees wants to know if you see epistemicide in what gets researched in LIS. For example, focus on technology / digital / new and shiny versus more practical elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this is just a problem in research, but I think with LIS more specifically, and especially if we look at like iSchools. I got my PhD at an iSchool. I'm working at an iSchool now, so I say this as an insider. You know, we see lots of tension about focusing on librarianship and what it means to be thinking of that type of service rather than HCI or something else that might be considered, you know, newer. I do think that there is a really high push to think about, you know, and even in this work, right, it's conceptual and it's very academic, but my goals aren't for it to stay there. My goals are for this to become something that is very applicable in terms of helping libraries, helping MLIS programs, helping information spaces to be critical about the injustices that they're committing, the harm that they're causing, and really start to work towards justice. So, you know, I think that all of academia is really guilty of that, myself included. You know, and I think that that's one of the things that we need to fix. You know, if we only value writing for the academic elite and we are in a field about practice, that is a huge injustice and definitely related to, you know, the large epistemicide.
Absolutely. Okay, another question for you. Can inclusion of harmful or inaccurate content or the false equivalency of neutrality in curating content be considered a type of epistemic harm?
Yes, I probably will have to think more about what exactly that means, you know, like where that falls in this space. But I don't understand why in 2020, we as an LIS field are still trying to maintain and uphold that libraries were ever neutral, are neutral, or should be neutral. We weren't, we are not, and we should never even try to be. That's not even an ideal we want. Libraries are radical spaces. We always have been, right? We want to make change, make information freely available. Like in a capitalist society, that's weird in and of itself, right? That's not neutral. Having value statements isn't neutral. I think that when we don't take the time to correct the normative behaviors, I think those ideas like, hey, we're neutral. If our community says, hey, I don't feel safe here, but yet we label ourselves as a safe space, it's a testimonial injustice, right? We're saying we are safe and we're disregarding the fact that you tell us you feel unsafe. If we're not correcting misinformation, then I think that might move into a curriculum injustice. And I think that if we're not correcting, the ideals of neutrality at large, we're limiting who can participate in the space. So, it's there. And I think it's there in a bunch of those places, just depending on, if we're talking about neutral book collections or like, the big idea of neutrality in libraries.
Yeah, Beth, and there was actually a question about, and you started just now to mention it, your thoughts about epistemicide in building library collections.
Yeah, we like to pretend or actually believe, I think in many cases, that we can build unbiased collections. And without being really critical, we cannot. We know that there's a Western publishing bias in the work that gets assigned in MLIS programs. Thanks to Dr. Dahlin, we know that publishing is biased when it comes to how children of color are represented in children's books. We know that if you look at the intersection of disability and race across all ages and materials, there is an extreme lack of representation at that intersection. And so, yeah, I think that we like to pretend that libraries and academia are these, and we are, right, these major collections of knowledge, these historical repositories, where the knowing is. But at the same time, we are missing all of these other community voices. And I think when we believe that our collection is the collection without thinking about what's out there, it's really harmful. There's a theory I really like about the Black Swan, and one of the parts of that is about our library, which is everything we've read, everything we've experienced, the things that we know, but also that our unlibrary, and that is all the things we haven't read and all the things we can't know and all the things we can't experience. And I think it takes a great amount of hubris to pretend that any library or any academic institution is gonna, be able to contain knowledge with a capital K. We are working with a small part of it, and it's time that we start acknowledging that.
Excellent, thank you. And just so you know, there are some other questions that kind of came in at the same time about collection development, collection policies. So I want to move on to another topic, but just so everyone knows, and so Beth knows, I'm compiling all of these questions for you in case it's helpful, for your research, of course. And Beth, if you have an opportunity or any type of desire to follow up with these questions, I can certainly post them. You and I can do another video or, what have you, because there's some really great questions here.
Fantastic.
So another attendee was saying, let's see, it was really a comment. She said, your wonderful talk made me think about how all of this impacts the way that library professionals organize information and the limitations of information access and retrieval because of epistemicide. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. I can just like check my yes. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So the next question we have, when I was in school, there were only a few African American students. I noticed a pattern over the years that our white teachers would usually and repeatedly assign Black authors to Black students, but white students were never made to read Black authors. How does this fit into the epistemic framework?
I honestly, I'm so annoyed, not annoyed by this question, but by that experience. And I know it personally. You know, I grew up every year being in high school, being the only Black student often. And, you know, every year I got assigned Maya Angelou or Langston Hughes. And it's like, I am not necessarily the person that needs to be exposed to this. You know, I think about the mirror, windows, and doors ideas that we've had going around information science and library and information science for so long, that metaphor, and just that, you know, we want people to see themselves reflected in our collections, but we also want to be using these experiences to expand the knowledge. I don't, you know, it is not wrong. It is important for Black people to engage with writings of the Black community, understanding different Black experiences, right? There's not a monolithic way to be Black. So like understanding, you know, what it means to be Black in Chicago is different than what it means to be Black in Miami or Black in Alabama. Those experiences are all different. And even within the communities, right? For each of us, that's going to change. And so the problem is not sometimes assigning Black people Black authors. The problem is that we have not intentionally integrated Black authors into our curriculums at a large level. And even when we are, we're selecting the more palatable authors from a more mainstream perspective, which is also, you know, not one of those ways where we are completely cutting knowledge access, but like limiting in that way. And I think that, you know, that's one of the things that I also really wanted us to think about, is that it's not all or nothing. This happens in shades of gray. And to me, that's one of those gray shades. Some of that is all right, but like we have to do better.
For sure. Another comment for you. The attendee says, I believe this is why lots of BIPOC don't feel like they're qualified to speak on topics even when they know the topic. This affects us on a deep psychological level, and just an expression of thanks for the talk. All right, another question. Let's see. Censorship of race-based research, especially critical race theory research, is a real problem. How do you see your research having an impact on the gatekeeping in LIS publishing?
Oh man, well, first of all, I hope that it will. I'm like, how do I start to answer this question? Oh man, this is a great question. Critical race theory, equity studies, inclusion, diversity programs have always been a threat because we intend to change our communities. And I think, you know, with our most recent administration, they went so far as to make it illegal and unfundable in terms of grants. If you're a researcher focusing on equity and you can't get federal grants because our government is not interested in supporting that work, this creates a real issue for our researchers in terms of, you know, what gets funded, which has a real impact in what gets published. Even for myself this year, when I was working on an IMLS grant, the time when it had to be due was still up in the air about how the election was going to work out. And even I ended up shifting what I wanted to focus on because I was afraid of this not being fundable anymore, depending on who our current administration was. So this is not a thing that's just affecting others. This is a thing that's also stifling myself. When I create new cultural competence classes, there's a reason that I call it cultural competence and not social justice. I might give, you know, something a different name. I think that communities of color have always been resourceful and resourceful in how they manage to find ways to work around those kinds of barriers that have been put in place to keep us from like effectively organizing. I hope sincerely that this work can help us really evaluate what that process looks like. It's all completely connected. What gets funded, what gets published, what people are, get to read and get exposed to in their library and information classes directly affects what's in our libraries. And we have to be willing to pull those things apart, but also look at what the system looks like collectively as it's moving. If we only analyze the little parts, we don't see the larger issue that we are creating across our fields.
Definitely. And what you were talking about with applying for IMLS, I have given sessions and talks on misinformation and disinformation for our library organizations, and have been explicitly told that I can't mention Trump. And they give me a list of words that I can't use because we don't want to upset our members. Well, then why are we having this talk then? Right? So, this goes back to everything you were saying. If we're not comfortable using these words, then we can't have the conversation. If we can't have the conversations, we can't change anything.
Right. And this is not the same as that, but I see this so often in like library chat groups and stuff too, where people are really like pushing to like keep a book like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And again, like, sure, fine, that's what you want to teach, great. But like, are you actually willing to like dig into the story and really talk about what's happening? Mm-hmm. And most of us, one, don't have the language to successfully do that like in a group, to like safely facilitate this conversation without harm. And we are afraid of not getting it right every time. And you've been doing this work for a really long time, as have I, and I'll make more mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
but not being brave, right, is not going to change anything. And one of the things that we need to see is everybody being willing to take these risks, to give themselves first to understand the problem, to give themselves the language to talk about the problem, and then work to address it. It's not going to happen if it's just the two of us,
Absolutely. Yeah. And just last question, we are almost at time, but I just want to try and get in as many as possible. How do you see epistemic injustices relating to the quote unquote support staff underclass working in libraries? We librarians like to believe that we matter more than they do.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important thing. And this is true in academia too. There is also, right, like a type of caste system that's happening there. Certainly if we, just at its most basic value, I think we can think about testimonial justice. Often I'd say the perspectives of, support staff or, staff versus faculty, that their opinions, perspectives are often undervalued, overlooked, and sometimes not included at all. I absolutely think that is a part of it, both for librarianship and academia.
All right, perfect, and right on time. So we are almost at the top of the hour, and our time is coming to an end. And I just want to sincerely thank Beth for spending some time with us and really challenging us with these ideas and this truth. And thank you all for coming out today and spending some time with us on a Thursday afternoon. Just as a reminder, the recording and the slides and a transcript will be up in a couple days, don't hold me to it, but it's coming shortly. So you'll be able to revisit this provocative talk and hopefully share it with your colleagues. And just one last commercial, we will be back next Thursday, same time, same station, with Dr. Aisha Johnson, who is another one of our fabulous LIS faculty members, who will be talking about her work in archives related to diversity. So thank you all again so much. Stay tuned to the site. Beth, I have lots of questions for you, and we may come back with a follow-up or like an after show for this
Great.
session.
That sounds great. Thank you
All
so
right.
much for this opportunity. And thanks everybody for listening along.
Absolutely. Thanks all so much. Be well, and we will meet again soon.